Hello, everyone. Just giving a couple of more seconds as people are joining. Okay, and see more people are joining. Um, First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the support of the interpreters we have today with us. So Tim on French, Miguel for Spanish, and Rashid in Arabic. So thank you. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Depending on where you're joining us from, thank you for being with us today. This webinar will be recorded so that we can share the recording with anyone who was unable to attend, and the recording is in process already. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, who you are, your name, where you're listening in from, so that we know who we all are. Onto some housekeeping items. So please keep your mics and cameras off to save on bandwidth. If you have any questions about the presentation or that you would like to bring to our presenters, please put them in the Q&A box. And this box is next to the globe icon in the bottom of your screen, at the bottom of your screen. We will ensure to take time throughout the webinar to answer your questions in the Q&A box. And if there are any outstanding ones, they will be answered after the webinar and shared with you all. For any other general questions or comments, please put them in the chat. And today, our webinar is on the topic of communicating infant and young child feeding during emergencies and the role of the media. So getting the right message across. Yeah. Next slide, please. This webinar is organized jointly by the Global Nutrition Cluster Technical Alliance and the Infant Feeding in Emergencies Core Group. In this slide, you can see the logos of all the member organizations of the webinar working group, as well as our donors, without whom we would not have been able to deliver this webinar. Next slide, please. Just to quickly give an overview of the Infant Feeding in Emergencies Core Group, or the IFE Core Group. The IFE Core Group is a global collaboration of agencies and individuals committed to the protection, promotion, and support of appropriate infant and young child feeding practices in emergencies. It was established in 1999 and was created to respond to concerns and gaps related to infant and young child feeding in emergencies. The IFE Core Group is dedicated to ensuring more effective infant and young child feeding in emergencies support in emergency contexts by strengthening learning, guidance and policies, planning, and capacity in infant and young child feeding in emergencies. Now, the QR code that you can see on this slide will take you to key global resources on infant and young child feeding in emergencies produced by the Core Group. Next slide, please. So the objectives for today's webinar include, first of all, sharing and disseminating existing infant and young child feeding in emergencies media resources that have been produced by the Infant Feeding in Emergencies Core Group. And then we would also want to showcase positive, harmful experiences of infant and young child feeding in emergencies communication during emergencies. We want to also identify how to prioritize infant and young child feeding in emergencies communications amongst the other priorities in the first few hours of an emergency. And finally, we would like to solicit input and suggestions from yourselves as participants on gaps and in guidance and tools that could be addressed by the Infant Feeding in Emergencies Core Group and the collective and the overall collective. Next slide, please. So today's agenda, so now that we've completed the introduction, we will be moving on to a quiz We will have 3 presentations and then a Mentimeter session and Q&A session, and eventually close the webinar. I'd like to please note that the opinions expressed within the content of this webinar are solely the authors and experts, and they may not reflect the opinions and the beliefs of the Global Nutrition Cluster Technical Alliance and or those of the Infant Feeding in Emergencies core group. If we can move on to the next slide. So without further, so just before moving on to starting our webinar, I would like to present our key speakers and facilitators. So we have Alex Yeyamo, Senior Emergency Nutrition Advisor from FHI 360. Myself, IFE Core Group Coordinator within the Core Group and Emergency Nutrition Network. Dr. Colleen Gribble, who's steering committee member of the IFE Core Group, also at Western Sydney University. We have Aissa Soumana, a nutrition specialist at UNICEF in Burkina Faso. We have Deborah Joy Wilson, nutrition specialist, individual consultant. Also have Jeanette McCulloch, who's communications and advocacy specialist at UNICEF. And Ms. Brigitte Tonon, who's health advisor, operational health and nutrition technical advisor at Action Against Hunger. Action contre la faim. So without further ado, I'd like to pass on to Jeanette McCulloch.
Thank you, Dima. I really appreciate the warm welcome today. So we wanted to start out today with a quick check-in to level set us all and to get a feel for what your familiarity is with the existing guidance. So we wanted to start out with a quiz. So if you could use your phone or you can use a browser on your screen, go to menti.com and use the code, or you can scan the QR code. I'm going to flip to the next slide, but all of that information will still be available there. And oh, look, this is wonderful. You all have already found your way there. So our first question is about the IFE core group guidance. Are you aware that the IFE core group has IYCFE media guidance? And we can see that we've got a good percentage of our folks that are aware of it, folks that are not aware of it, which is a big part of the reason why we are here today. And I'm going to let you all take just another moment to answer here, but it looks like we're getting a nice stable response of how many folks are aware of the guidance versus how many are not. And I'm now going to switch to our next question. Our next question is about your use of that guidance. So have you used the IYCFE media guidance that is published by the IFE core group? And if you are following along with the interpreter, the first response is yes, the second response is no. And if you have not joined us yet, we are at menti.com and the code is 8338. 1686. And it looks like the link is also in the chat if you'd like to participate there. And again, a big part of why we're here today, even though many of you are aware of the guidance, you have not yet had the opportunity to use the guidance. And you can see how many folks so far have used it and how many have not. Okay, and I'm going to pass this over to our next presenter. Carlene, I'm going to pass it along to you.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. It was very interesting to see that people were aware that there was guidance, but perhaps hadn't used it very much. So hopefully this afternoon's webinar will actually help people to become more familiar with the guidance and perhaps use it. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what we have in terms of guidance from the IFE core group. Next slide, please. Before I talk about the media guidance that the IFE core group has, I just thought that I would let you know about our main guidance document, which I'm sure that many of you are aware of, the operational guidance for infant and young child feeding in emergencies. So this was the first bit of guidance that the IFE core group ever produced, and it's our most important guidance. The goal of this document is to maximise child health and survival through enabling appropriate infant and young child feeding in emergencies. It provides concise, practical guidance on how to ensure appropriate infant and young child feeding in any sort of emergency. Now, this document has been endorsed by the World Health Assembly and Resolution 63.23 says that all member countries of the World Health Assembly should ensure that their emergency planning is in line with this document. Next slide, please. So just to summarise the different sections of the operational guidance, because it breaks it down into what you should do in different areas. First of all, endorsing and developing policies, then training staff, coordinating operations, assessing and monitoring, and then protecting and promoting and supporting optimal infant and young child feeding with integrated multi-sector interventions and minimise the risks of artificial feeding. If you haven't had a look at the operational guidance before, I would suggest that you have a look. It's been translated into many languages, and you can find it in links that you'll find later in the presentation. But if you just Google search for it, you'll find it as well. Next slide, please. So why did the IFE core group develop resources on infant and young child feeding in emergencies and media and communication? Well, the media is extremely important in emergencies. It alerts public to the fact that there is an emergency and can also mobilise funds and assistance. But the media, when it's not, I guess, informed about what will help to support infants and young children in emergencies, it can also start and perpetuate myths and cause problems. I've lost the slide. Can we go back a slide, please? It can also, we have disaster myths around infant and young child feeding in emergencies. And I'll point out a few of what those are a little bit later. So poor media and communications in relation to infant and young child feeding in emergencies are very common. And one of the biggest problems that we have with poor communications is that they drive and support inappropriate donations and distributions of breast milk substitutes, including infant formula and other milk products. And I'm sure that any of you who are involved in infant and young child feeding in emergencies know how difficult it can be to try and prevent donations and to stop their harmful distribution. But if we have good media and communications, that can actually help to prevent harmful aid and encourage support that protects infants and young children. And so, you know, we want to encourage good media and communications because that will make everybody's job easier and also support the health and well-being of infants and young children and their mothers. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give you an example here. It's from nearly 20 years ago now, from the Indian Ocean tsunami. But somebody there from the Ministry of Health in Sri Lanka, I think, provided a really succinct example of why we need to have good media and communications in emergencies. So I'm just going to read out this quote. So this was after the Indian Ocean tsunami, and this Ministry of Health official said, although Sri Lanka is a country with a high exclusive breastfeeding rate, there was a myth among mothers about the inability to produce enough breast milk when under stress. A major problem was the distribution of infant formula and feeding bottles by donors and NGOs without appropriate controls to breastfeeding mothers. Donors acted emotionally without any scientific basis, disregarding the dangers of artificial feeding in disasters. Additionally, the mass media was very keen on feeding babies, so made a public appeal to supply artificial milk and feeding bottles. The Ministry of Health faced many challenges to ensure that breastfeeding mothers continued to do so and did not swap to unsustainable and potentially dangerous infant formula. So, yes, describing what happened there in Sri Lanka and many other countries after the Indian Ocean tsunami and in many other emergencies since. And you can in fact see in the photographs there on the slide, both of these photographs are from Sri Lanka, and you can see in both of those photos, infant formula is being distributed. And there are women who are breastfeeding. They're being given infant formula. They don't need it. It's not being supported properly, and it's going to cause harm. And that is why we must do better with our media and communications in order to ensure that infants are protected and there are fewer donations. Next slide, please. To give you an example here from what can happen in terms of what is reported in the media, this is from the Wenchuan earthquake in China, which occurred in 2011. And I undertook an analysis of what was actually being reported in the media at that time. And you can see here that the most common thing that was reported was about donations of infant formula, baby food, or milk being made. The second most common thing that was reported was that babies were in need of milk or were lacking food. And the third most common thing that was reported were that women were too traumatized or malnourished to breastfeed. The things that were not reported very frequently were that actually that mothers needed breastfeeding counselling after the disaster to help them to continue breastfeeding, that donations of infant formula were a problem, and that artificial feeding is risky in emergencies, whereas breastfeeding is vital for child survival during emergencies. So you can see this is an example of an emergency where the media messages were encouraging donations and not reporting on the things that would actually help infants and young children and their mothers and other caregivers. Next slide, please. So the IFE Core Group has produced a number of resources to assist people to work with the media and improve the reporting that is done during disasters. So I have, there are 4 different documents, and I'm just going to give a brief summary of each and what is contained within. So next slide, please. So the first document is the Infant and Young Child Feeding in Emergencies Information for the Media. So this is a basic guidance document for journalists who might not know anything at all really about infant and young child feeding in emergencies. And it describes why infants and young children are vulnerable in emergencies, talks about what the challenges are in feeding infants and young children in emergencies, talks about how the survival of infants and young children can be protected during emergencies, and how journalists can help to protect infants and young children in emergencies. And the key message that is in that box there at the bottom from the document is saying, you know, the media is really important. They have a really important job in protecting and supporting the health and well-being of infants and young children in emergencies through supporting appropriate infant and young child feeding. So it's just really emphasising how important they are and trying to get them to do things that are going to be helpful and not harmful. Next slide, please. So the next document is how to write and talk about infant and young child feeding in emergencies. Now, this guidance document is more for people who are within agencies, communication specialists, and any individual who might speak to journalists. So communication specialists or somebody who might be interviewed by journalists about an emergency response. And the purpose of this document is to support communication experts to provide accurate information that protects and supports infant and young children and their caregivers and reduces harmful interventions in emergencies. It describes what messages support and what messages undermine helpful aid to infants and young children. It also provides some information on what sort of photographs are helpful and what sort of photographs should be avoided in media and communications, and describes how to get journalists interested in telling stories and providing information in their stories that supports helpful aid to infants and young children. Next slide, please. Now, this is the sort of the final text-heavy information document. So this is background information to support communications experts. So this document provides more in-depth information for communications experts within organisations and agencies to help them to be effective in their role around infant and young child feeding in emergencies. So it outlines why infants are vulnerable in emergencies, how media communications impact infant and young child feeding in emergencies, what communications experts need to know to help infants and young children in emergencies, how emergencies affect feeding practices. It talks about disaster myths in emergencies, and I mentioned that at the beginning. One of the disaster myths that we have is that stress can reduce women's milk production in disasters. It's not true, it doesn't happen, but it is something that very many women believe, that very many nutrition workers and health professionals believe, and it's something that there needs to be good information in media communications about, so that can actually support women to keep breastfeeding through emergencies. This document also describes what content should be in media reporting, ideally, in order to support the well-being of infants and young children in emergencies. Next slide, please. The final document that I'm just going to tell you about is the Model Joint Statement on Infant and Young Child Feeding in Emergencies. This isn't a guidance document. This is actually a template document to actually provide, almost as a press release, it can go out to journalists to explain to them how to, what needs to be done following an emergency, how to, it also talks about how joint statements, so a statement that is supported by a number of organisations around infant and young child feeding in emergencies, that will contain information that explains, why breastfeeding is important in emergencies, how to support women to continue breastfeeding, why donations are a bad idea and how they can be harmful. The idea with this is actually for it to be given to journalists very soon after an emergency, to try and stop donations from coming, because they often come very quickly. So our Model Joint Statement document actually has a joint statement in it that can be adapted very easily for any emergency, but it also explains how to use it as well. So it's a very, very useful tool for those who are, trying to support infant and young children in emergencies. Next slide, please. So on the ground when an emergency occurs and need to do something quickly. This tool is there to help you to get a joint statement out very quickly. Next slide, please. So turning all of this guidance into action, well, some of the things that you can do to make that happen is firstly, include the guidance in orientations for new communications and fundraising staff and ensure that existing staff are familiar with the guidance. Deliver training on the operational guidance on infant and young child feeding in emergencies in the media and communications guidance to staff. Integrate relevant content into existing organisational policies. And as an emergency preparedness action, plan for early release of a joint statement in the event of an emergency by coordinating with potential signees to a joint statement before an emergency occurs. Next slide, please. So I've just got a question here just for you to think about. How do you think you could use the IFE core group media and communications guidance in your work? Who might you tell about it? What might you do? So this is just something to think about as we continue through the rest of the webinar. So I'm just going to hand over to the next presentation now. I hope that some of the information that I've provided has been useful to you.
Bonjour, je vais vous partager l'expérience du Niger par rapport à la communication sur l'ange dans les circonstances d'urgence, notamment pendant l'épidémie de COVID-19. Slide, s'il vous plaît. Next slide, please. OK, et next slide. Donc, pendant l'épidémie de COVID-19, nous avons fait une adaptation de... Can you go back, please? For the first slide. For the context. OK, nous avons fait une adaptation pour le COVID-19 pour nous assurer de la continuité de la réponse par rapport à la nutrition. Nous avons fait une adaptation des messages qui ont été développés pour le COVID-19 pour nous assurer que les messages et les recommandations sont clairs sur comment continuer à promouvoir l'allaitement au niveau des agents de santé, mais aussi au niveau des agents de santé communautaires et au niveau des partenaires et aussi les familles, mais aussi pour prévenir les risques, les risques de dons de lait industriel, comme cela était arrivé dans le passé. Next slide, please. Donc, par rapport à cette adaptation, nous avons fait deux approches. Nous avons élaboré au niveau du pays une déclaration conjointe à travers le cluster nutrition et aussi nous avons fait une communication. Nous avons adapté les messages sur l'allaitement maternel et en les adaptant au contexte du COVID. Donc, nous avons pour la déclaration conjointe, c'était vraiment une déclaration globale qui devait toucher l'ensemble des acteurs. Et aussi, nous avons, pour les canaux de communication, cette déclaration conjointe a été disséminée à travers différents types de médias, à travers les télévisions, à travers la presse digitale et à travers aussi les radios, les différentes radios communautaires et la presse écrite. Les messages promotionnels pour le COVID aussi ont touché presque toute la communauté. Donc, c'est les différents types d'acteurs à différents niveaux ont été touchés à travers cela. Donc, nous avons utilisé pour cela les radios communautaires, nous avons utilisé les médias sociaux. Les messages ont été disséminés sur Facebook, sur Twitter, sur Instagram, mais aussi au niveau de des messages SMS aussi ont été diffusés au niveau du pays. Next slide, please. Next slide. OK. L'objectif de la déclaration conjointe, c'était vraiment de pouvoir coordonner la réponse la réponse ange pendant le COVID-19, mais aussi d'harmoniser les messages. Et aussi, l'autre objectif aussi, c'était de nous assurer du respect du Code international de commercialisation des subsides du lait maternel et le décret qui existe au niveau du pays pour la réglementation de la commercialisation des substituts du lait maternel. Next slide. Donc, voici un exemple de quelques messages qui ont été développés dans la déclaration et dans le document technique, la note technique Ange, nous avons fait des messages clés qui donnent des recommandations et aussi les actions à entreprendre pour la diffusion des messages Ange. Next slide. Donc ça aussi, ici, c'est un exemple de message. Nous avons développé un cadre par rapport au message. Pour chaque message élaboré, nous avons donné quels sont les principaux messages qu'il faut propager et quels sont les messages secondaires qui découlent de ce message-là. Nous avons développé les différentes cibles et aussi les différents canaux de transmission pour ce message-là. Et après cela, la définition de ces messages-là nous a permis de pouvoir les adapter au niveau de chaque région et au niveau des utilisations que nous allons faire par rapport à chaque cible. Donc, au niveau de chaque région, les acteurs des régions, les acteurs de la santé, de la nutrition, mais aussi les médias se sont réunis au niveau national pour pour traduire ces messages-là dans les différentes langues qui sont au niveau des régions. Donc, au niveau des régions. Et après cela, il y a eu des formations des agents des agents des médias et aussi pour pouvoir aller diffuser ces messages au niveau au niveau des radios communautaires. De même, ces messages ont été adaptés pour pouvoir les utiliser sur les réseaux sociaux de UNICEF, à savoir Facebook, Twitter et puis Instagram. Nous avons adapté ces messages-là et aussi les messages ont été adaptés pour être passés par WhatsApp et aussi par SMS par les compagnies de téléphonie. Nous avons aussi fait une adaptation de ces messages-là pour une plateforme. Il existait une plateforme des jeunes, Mouria Matassa, et ces messages ont été adaptés pour être diffusés à travers cette plateforme-là. Prochaine slide. Donc, pour les messages, après l'adaptation des messages, nous avons fait 3 mois de contrat avec les radios communautaires. Et donc, de septembre à novembre, les messages ont été passés au niveau des différentes radios communautaires qui existent dans tout le pays. Et nous avons aussi fait produire, j'avais déjà parlé de ça, les spots qui ont été produits ont été passés, mais après cela aussi, au niveau de chaque district sanitaire, des débats interactifs ont été faits, un débat ou 2 par semaine au niveau des districts sanitaires pour discuter des messages et de comment est-ce que l'alimentation de l'enfant, en particulier l'allaitement maternel, doit se faire pendant la période du COVID. Au niveau des zones où nous avons des groupes de soutien où dans certaines zones d'urgence, comme la région de Tillabéri, des radios aussi ont été achetées et mises à disposition des groupes de soutien Ange pour pouvoir passer et pour pouvoir permettre aux mamans d'écouter les messages qui passent à travers les réseaux. Next slide, please. Par rapport à cette période-là aussi, nous avons contractualisé avec le studio Kalangu, qui est un studio qui est en partenariat avec 45 radios communautaires, où nous avons fait un télé-débat qui a été diffusé à travers certains médias, mais aussi l'audio a été passé à travers les radios communautaires. Et ce télé-débat a été organisé et les participants, c'était le ministère de la Santé et nous avons aussi un pédiatre et aussi l'UNICEF qui ont discuté et donné des informations sur qu'est-ce que le COVID-19 et comment est-ce qu'on pourrait continuer à alimenter l'enfant pendant la période de COVID-19. Slide, please. OK, donc qu'est-ce qui a marché et qu'est-ce qui n'a pas marché? Donc, le plus important, c'est qui a marché, c'est que la signature de la déclaration conjointe par le ministère de la Santé, l'OMS et l'UNICEF a permis de pouvoir faire un fort plaidoyer et de passer l'information sur tous les différents types de médias, ce qui a été relayé et ça a créé ça a permis de passer un message et attirer l'attention de beaucoup de personnes. Et ça, c'était aussi l'occasion de pouvoir informer les journalistes sur le sujet et qui ont pris le relais à un certain niveau. Et ce qui n'a pas marché, c'est que et, ce qui n'a pas marché, c'est que ça a pris beaucoup de temps pour la signature. La signature de la déclaration, ça a fait beaucoup de va-et-vient. Et aussi, avant la signature, il y a eu déjà un don de lait industriel au niveau, le gouvernement a reçu un don de lait industriel de certaines firmes qui vendent du lait artificiel. Slide, please. Donc, par rapport aux radios communautaires aussi, ce qui a marché, c'est que les radios communautaires, ça nous a permis à ce niveau-là vraiment de faire des contrats avec toutes les radios communautaires qui sont au niveau du pays. 99 spots radio ont été produits et 379 émissions radio ont été enregistrées. Nous avons potentiellement touché 6 millions d'habitants sur les 25 millions d'habitants et nous avons eu la participation et l'engouement de beaucoup de médias, que ce soit au niveau national et puis ou bien au niveau du terrain. Et nous avons aussi, malgré le challenge auquel nous avons été confrontés par rapport au regroupement, nous avons utilisé quand même des moyens pour pouvoir passer les messages. Et le gouvernement, à travers le ministère de la Santé, à travers la direction de la nutrition du ministère de la Santé, a pris le lead pour vraiment assurer d'organiser ces événements-là, faire le contrat avec les radios communautaires, assurer le suivi et la collecte des données. Donc, ce qui n'a pas marché, c'est vraiment comment savoir combien de personnes ont été touchées. Nous avons fait des contrats avec les radios communautaires, mais on ne peut pas savoir exactement, on ne pouvait pas savoir exactement combien de personnes ont suivi l'émission radio. Les chiffres que nous avons ont été une projection de la couverture de ces radios communautaires qui peut être plus ou moins. Donc, on n'avait pas vraiment les chiffres exacts pour cela. Et pour les social médias aussi, on ne peut pas savoir exactement combien de personnes ont regardé le message sur Facebook, sur Twitter ou bien Instagram, parce que si la personne n'a pas cliqué sur aimer et autres, c'est pas évident de savoir. Et on n'a pas aussi eu l'opportunité de savoir quel est l'impact de ces messages-là sur la population ou ceux qui ont déjà écoutez, donc c'est vraiment c'est vraiment quelque chose qui n'a pas marché par rapport à cela. Next slide, please. Donc, quels sont les défis et les leçons apprises? Et par rapport aux défis, la traduction des messages en langue locale nous a pris vraiment énormément de temps parce que le Niger est un pays assez vaste. On a traduit dans 8 langues locales, mais quand je prends l'exemple, peut-être tu peux prendre la langue qui est le Hausa, qui est parlée dans beaucoup de régions, mais il y a certains mots et certaines expressions qui diffèrent d'une région à l'autre. Donc, on a dû nous assurer de faire un message de traduire les messages au niveau de chaque région. Donc aussi, comme je l'avais dit, on ne pouvait pas mesurer l'impact des messages sur la population. Et, par rapport aux plateformes aussi, nous avons la plateforme des jeunes sur laquelle on avait beaucoup compté et qui nous avait aussi pris beaucoup de temps pour l'adaptation de messages qui finalement n'a pas été n'était pas fonctionnel, donc on n'a pas pu utiliser pour faire passer les messages par rapport à cette plateforme-là. Donc, on aurait vraiment voulu aimer diversifier, avoir beaucoup plus de plateformes diversifiées. Donc, ce qui a marché aussi, c'est vraiment le leadership du gouvernement et aussi la coordination. Nous avons fait une bonne coordination avec les différents acteurs parce qu'au début du COVID, chacun se mettait à faire des actions, des messages à part, mais cette coordination nous a permis de bien regarder, avoir une note technique sur comment continuer les activités sur l'alimentation du nourrisson et du jeune enfant au niveau du pays, quels sont les messages qu'il faut passer et quels sont les médias et aussi les canaux qu'il faut utiliser. Donc, ça a été vraiment harmonisé avec tous les autres acteurs au niveau du pays. Et par rapport aux leçons apprises, c'est que les médias sociaux sont quand même un canal de communication assez puissant. Et, et vraiment, ça permet de compléter les autres canaux parce qu'on utilisait déjà les radios communautaires avant l'urgence, mais vraiment, on ne s'appuyait pas trop là-dessus parce qu'on s'appuyait plus sur les counseling individuels, les visites à domicile qui permettent quand même d'avoir un peu plus d'impact et de faire un counseling spécifique. Mais la situation d'urgence nous a permis de comprendre l'importance de ces radios communautaires, surtout par rapport au COVID et aussi dans les zones d'urgence où on ne peut pas atteindre la population, les radios communautaires et aussi les SMS et autres nous ont permis de pouvoir quand même de continuer les interventions et de pouvoir quand même toucher la population même pendant ces périodes-là. Et le fait que nous avons déjà des partenariats avec ces radios communautaires nous a permis d'aller très vite et de pouvoir mettre en place ces informations-là et pouvoir faire rapidement les contrats et continuer la diffusion. Next slide, please. Merci beaucoup et je pense que je vais passer la parole à Déborah pour la prochaine présentation. Merci.
Yeah, greetings everyone. I'm now going to talk about media and communication materials that we really need to avoid. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So during this presentation, I'd like you to consider the context in which you work or you have worked, and how you can apply the learning from today to avoid harmful communication and to promote recommended practices for the health and well-being of infants and young children and their mother or primary caregivers. So coordinated, timely and accurate and harmonized communication to the affected population, emergency responders and the media is essential to the well-being of the population, and this is highlighted in the operational guidance. So communication and the media play a critical part in emergency response by informing the public of the emergency context and also mobilizing funds and assistance. However, inaccurate, erroneous or incomplete information this may be written or images, they can be misleading and harmful and thereby undermining good infant young child feeding practices and services. So some of the reasons for potentially harmful information include a lack of awareness of infant young child feeding and emergencies and humanitarian aid more broadly, many myths about infant and young child feeding. It's hard to publicize aid that's not in the form of giving physical goods, and the perception that donations and distributions of commercial milk formula, which is infant formula, and other breast milk substitutes, bottles, teats, and other inappropriate supplies are helpful. So the increase in the availability of and access to platforms through which to communicate, internet technology, social media, etc., has increased the risk of harmful information being conveyed. And in this presentation, I will give examples of communication in the form of script and images which can cause harm. Next slide, please. So the types of communication that can cause harm, I've categorized into misinformation, which is incorrect or erroneous information, or images which are spread regardless of that intent to mislead. So they may be, inadvertently misleading. And disinformation, and that's misinformation which is knowingly or intentionally spread, which is deliberately misleading or biased information and could be manipulated narrative or facts. So these can be again broken down into further categories: misconceptions and myths, mischaracterization, which is describing a situation, event, or person wrongly, that is misrepresentative, and this may be because the information is incomplete or it's not put into the context, or it may be inappropriate, which, in other words, not suitable or proper to these circumstances. And these can cause harm by reducing caregivers' confidence or caregivers demanding aid, which can be harmful, or preventing them from actually getting the help they need, or result in provision of harmful aid. Next slide. So following, I'm going to present some examples of mischaracterization, misconception, or myths, and some clarification. So I've given some examples of misclarification there. And for example, this is a common presentation that infants are crying because they're not getting enough food or breast milk. And we've just got to understand there are many reasons babies cry, especially during an emergency when the family's in turmoil. And infants and young children also feel stress, and breastfeeding can actually help calm mother and child. We also still have that, some remnants of that philanthropic mindset of giving aid in the form of product. Instead, there's a need for articles informing on breastfeeding and complementary feeding as actually being protective, life-saving practices. When we look at misconceptions or myths, not having enough or good quality food is commonly conveyed, but putting the child to the breast frequently with correct positioning, attachment, and other support, it supports breastfeeding. Being severely nourished or stress can very temporarily affect mother's breastfeed. Again, put frequently for successful breastfeeding. Caregivers can demand commercial infant formula, milk formula, as they're influenced by the media and seeing donations. So they think that's what they need, even if they have been breastfeeding up to that point. Next slide, please. So I've given lots of examples of inappropriate communication, and a lot of these are highlighted but by the recommendations in the International Code of the Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes and the subsequent addendums. And these relate to milk products that are specifically marketed for feeding of infants and young children up to the age of 3 years. And it relates to other foods and beverages promoted to be suitable for feeding a baby during the first 6 months when exclusive breastfeeding is recommended. Information on artificial feeding, including that on labels, should actually explain the benefits of breastfeeding, the costs and dangers associated with unnecessary or improper use of commercial milk formula and other breast milk substitutes. And the code explicitly states that there should be no advertising or other form of promotion to the general public. And this would include any advertising through mass media outlets such as television, magazine, billboards, websites, or other social media. So considering complementary feeding, foods to not call for or donate, that's also important. You know, foods and drinks of low nutrient value or high in salt and sugar, foods and feeding bottles, foods that may cause choking such as whole nuts, foods labelled for children less than 6 months of age. When we're considering images, there should not be pictures of infants or other pictures idealizing the use of breast milk substitutes. Babies with the mother edited or cropped out of the picture as the mother, you know, we need them together as the mother and baby are a biological caregiving dyad. Images where informed consent has not been obtained. You know, we really need to ensure that all images have got informed consent. You know, getting away from perhaps a patriarchal view that consent is implied through the assumption that the subject won't mind. So in emergencies, an influx of commercial formula donations has often been observed after the emergency onset, followed by untargeted distribution of commercial milk formula and eventually a decline in exclusive breastfeeding prevalence in the affected area. This was an example was in the Ukraine 2015 emergency and the Yogyakarta Indonesian earthquake in 2006. So in emergency situations, the code is particularly important for controlling donations and distributions of these products. So these children, there are also infants who cannot breastfeed, such as infants separated from their mothers, infants or whose mothers are ill or have died, or those not being breastfed prior to the emergency where relactation is determined not feasible. And these children do need targeted support with controlled use of commercial milk formula provided by health workers, community workers, and only to mothers who need it, and mothers clearly informed of the hazards associated with improper use. Next slide, please. Now we're going to look at media articles that can cause harm, and we're going to whiz through these. But as we look at the following slides, consider what is the issue of concern. Is it mass characterization or misconception or a myth, or is it inappropriate? How may it do harm? What could you do to respond to the issue if you became aware of it, if you saw an article, you saw an image that was potentially harmful or inappropriate? And how could it have been prevented from happening in the first place? In other words, being presented. So next slide, please. This is an article that implies the mother cannot provide enough breast milk for her baby because she doesn't have enough or good food. But in fact, there are many reasons why a woman may report that she does not have enough breast milk. Next slide, please. Here, article from East Kenya on the crisis that again implies that mothers who are malnourished cannot breastfeed. Next slide, please. This was an article here from Ukraine and one from Libya, and they call for donations of commercial milk formula. Inappropriate. Next slide, please. Here, the Australian Defence Force providing baby formula. So, you know, it implies that baby formula or commercial milk formula is needed to save lives, and the heroism of providing it. Though it may be slowly changing, again, you know, I reiterate the vestige remain in the reporting of saviorism and that privileges the neo-colonialist views, and the attitudes of aid workers and experts are superior to this perspectives of locals who are actually experiencing the crisis. Next slide, please. This from the Turkish Canadian Society of Edmonton, collecting commercial milk formula donations. It reflects again a violation of the code and also the commercial milk formula procurement standard operation practices, which were actually issued by UNICEF, and also infant young child feeding statements released by the national government. And this exacerbated the spread of misinformation on commercial milk formula feeding and well-meaning individuals' lack of awareness and appropriate infant feeding practices and emergencies. Next slide, please. Again, sharing information on their donation efforts is that they're going to help through this bulk provision of commercial milk formula. Next slide, please. This actually relates to and states and displays loyal health workers supporting, collecting commercial infant formula. Next slide, please. Here we have an example of you know, how much gratitude is given for a Malaysian businessman giving out infant formula, which, you know, is well intended. You know, people really think they're, you know, they're helping, but it's implying his, you know, his act as one of caring by stating childhood experience with hunger motivate him to provide infant formula to less fortunate children, earning him the affectionate name of Abang Susu, in other words, brother milk. So although he's meaning, you know, he has some good intentions, you know, really the message needs to get across. Next slide, please. Again, another example. This is in northern Lombok, Indonesia, and breastfeeding mother implies that she needs infant formula, states that she's worried her baby is going to get sick because of the way things are, and that some commercial milk formula is therefore needed. This, although she's a breastfeeding mother. Next slide, please. This article about the Maui fires implies that commercial milk formula is an essential baby supply. Next slide, please. This Japan earthquake photo gives inappropriate emphasis to the feeding of commercial milk formula and bottle feeding, implying that it's a good support role of aid workers to be giving it. So the preferred image would be of a woman holding and breastfeeding, providing breast milk for her child, supported by the aid worker. So we have a few more slides, but we go down to a bit further because we're running out of time here, and you'll be able to get these within the slides when you receive them. So if we can move forward down to the slide on the common and rare media analysis, that's correct, great. Where, you know, some of the messages, and again, this was done by Carleen Gribble, who presented earlier, is an infant feeding and emergencies core group steering committee member. So, you know, highlight the babies were vulnerable, and that, you know, that, and no link was made to the role that breastfeeding plays in preventing diarrhea, and that formula feeding can, you know, cause for diarrhea, They found that, you know, babies need to be fed. Mention women breastfeeding, but it's used to show weakness with no mention that breastfeeding actually protects babies, and providing infant formula will save babies, but no mention again of the risk of formula feeding. So can you go to the final slide, please? So, you know, I reiterate, agencies need to, and every representative of agencies need to support the media with appropriate information so that the media can convey and portray information that supports life-saving infant feeding and emergency practices. They need to ensure that communication encourages helpful aid. And previously, Carleen gave some examples of what you can do. So again, every time you look at your communication, consider do no harm. Thank you. And I apologize, we've had to scroll through some of those slides. You'll see when you receive them. Our next presenter, please.
Well, Deborah, thank you so much. That was an incredible presentation. We are going to be moving to our next Mentimeter slide. So for those of you who are just joining, if you can visit at menti.com, you can also use your device, your phone or a tablet to scan the QR code. Or additionally, there is a link that you can follow in the chat. So if you click on the link on the chat, that will take you to our polling question. And again, it's menti, MENTI.com, and the code is 833-81686. And that code will still be available as we bring up the next question. So we really want to take this opportunity to learn from all of you. So we've got a question up here on the screen. It is, what would you need to improve IYCFE, infant and young child feeding in emergencies, messages and communication during the emergency response? And again, if you go to menti.com and use code 833-81686 to share your messages, I think this is a great opportunity to really integrate everything that we have heard so far today. We heard really about what the harms of media messages are that undermine the best practices of infant feeding in emergencies. We heard an incredibly inspiring example in Nigeria of best practices in action, and learned a little bit about what works, what doesn't, what the challenges are. And we've gotten some great strategies for ensuring that the information that's out there during emergencies encourages helpful aid and helpful information for families as well. And we've already got a number of responses here, including what would you need to improve? It would include coordinating with our communications colleagues. We heard a lot about that during the preparation of this webinar, and I think this is an incredibly important piece of next steps. Acceptance of my own organization. Some staff know what's appropriate and what's not. I think that very much coordinates with this earlier point, right? That this is something that we're all going to want to go and take back to the organizations where we work and make sure that this kind of information is disseminated to the folks who really need to operationalize it during times when one of the things we heard about, of course, in preparation for this webinar was this is one of many, many competing interests during that time. So making sure in advance that folks have that information. Key do's and don'ts for media communication in IYCFE. And one of the things that you'll receive as a follow-up are the recording for this presentation with many of the materials that were shared here. toolkit with easily adaptable key messages, educate journalists, easy to use examples for our communications department. Again, this idea of what does it take to help share this information with all the people who need it in a timely way. Supervising information on social. There's so much here that there's no way I'm going to be able to recap it all at this point. But what I do want to do is move on to our next question briefly, just so we have enough time for Q&A. So our next question here, and thank you all for sharing these points. All of these points are going to go back to all of us at the IFE core group, and all of your thoughts, feedback, information, incredibly helpful. Next, our next question is this. Please suggest one message that we could use to promote infant and young child feeding during emergencies. And again, we're in the same place. It's menti.com, and use code 8338-1686. I love the first message that came up on the screen. Women need lactation support, right? Support mothers to breastfeed. Breastfeeding save lives in emergency. First, do no harm. First, do no harm. Mother and baby are one unit. Breastfeeding protects infants. I'm going to let this continue to run because I think there's some really amazing messages that are coming in here. I think this is all important information for all of us to take in and for all of you to have available as you're thinking about communicating as well. And I'm going to leave this up for just a moment as I hand this off to Brigitte for Q&A. You can continue to pop messages in here. And again, we will get all of those. Great. And Brigitte, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you everyone for participating to this webinar. And so we have been reading all of your questions. So I've got a first question for you, Caroline. So one of the best practices for media relation in emergency start before the crisis emergency. So like, for example, forming or maintaining a good relationship with the media, or providing the media continuous facts and information and good breastfeeding practices, so that we could control the narrative by the media in emergency situation. So one participant is curious to know if this was a case for the case study given in Sri Lanka. So, for example, to have continuous strong relationship with the media. So, Caroline, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigitte. I don't know what the situation was in Sri Lanka, but I do agree. It is the best situation is to develop relationships with journalists before the emergency happens, and for them to have increased knowledge, and so that they can actually be champions when an emergency occurs. And so getting journalists interested in emergency preparedness, I think is something that is quite a valuable thing to do. And in countries where there are seasonal emergencies, so we know in some parts of the world we have typhoons every year, there are cyclones every year, there are bushfires every year. Getting journalists to actually provide messages before the emergency occurs that breastfeeding is a part of emergency preparedness, that it protects babies if an emergency happens. That's just one thing that can be done to actually build relationships with journalists, so that when an emergency occurs, they already have quite a lot of knowledge and they're going to do good work. So I think that development of relationships is, I agree, 100% very, very important.
Thank you very much for your answer. I hope this was clear for everyone. Now we've got some questions for Aisha. So Aisha, one of the questions was related to the media. So media conveying information and communication in different languages, that was understood. So you have mentioned some translation, but can you detail a little bit more? And there was a question specifically dedicated for individuals with disabilities. Did you consider specific communication for this group? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Brigitte. Donc, par rapport au message, les messages ont été traduits dans les 8 langues principales du pays et la traduction a été faite, comme je l'ai dit, par région. Donc, les messages ont été passés dans les langues locales au niveau de chaque région et dans les langues principales au niveau de ces régions. Au niveau national, les messages ont été traduits dans les 8 langues du pays. Et donc, parce que la radio qui se trouve au niveau national émet sur tout le pays. Mais les différentes radios communautaires, elles ont été faites, par exemple, dans certaines régions, ça a été traduit en 4 langues. Dans d'autres régions, c'est 5 langues, principalement le Hausa, le Jarma, le Peul, le Gomanche, le Tamashek, qui sont le Kanouri, le Toubou et l'arabe, qui sont les principales langues qui sont au niveau du pays. Donc, nous avons fait la traduction et comme je l'avais expliqué dans ma présentation, les traductions ont été faites et même si c'est le Hausa, on a fait des traductions différentes par région parce qu'il y a certains mots qui sont utilisés qui sont un peu différents. Donc, c'est comme ça que cela avait été fait. Et chaque radio communautaire nous avait donné un plan un plan d'émission. Par exemple, il y a des radios qui émettaient 2 fois par jour, d'autres émettaient 3 fois par jour et avec un calendrier sur quelle langue doit passer quel jour et à quelle heure. Donc, c'est un peu ce qui a été fait. Par rapport aux enfants avec des handicaps, on n'a pas fait spécifiquement de focus sur ça. Les messages ont été faits beaucoup plus global pour les enfants, mais y compris quel soutien psychosocial il fallait apporter à la femme qui a été détectée positive par rapport au COVID et tout ça. Mais spécifiquement pour les enfants en handicap, cela n'a pas été, on n'a pas fait de message spécifique pour cela, mais et comme on avait déjà, c'est à ce moment-là qu'on avait commencé au Niger à travailler sur tout ce qui est early child development, voir les enfants en disabilité, faire le care for caregivers. Donc, on avait quand même la possibilité de déplacer. Il y a certains enfants qui étaient suivis au niveau des hôpitaux. Il y a quand même eu des missions pour quand même aller sur le terrain, même si c'est dans le contexte du COVID, pour voir qu'est-ce qui est devenu de ces enfants-là après la sortie de l'hôpital et pouvoir appuyer les familles. Donc, c'est ce qui a été fait. Merci.
Thanks a lot. I will keep you, Aisha, with a second question. So it was great again to see all your lessons learned. We wanted to know if you have experienced any social media crisis in your communication, like, for example, the spread of misinformation on IOSF, or was the process really smooth?
OK. Non, on n'a pas eu de problème par rapport à des incompréhensions ou bien à des messages qui ne sont pas adaptés. Parce que nous avons au niveau du pays, au niveau du Niger, nous avons toujours travaillé avec les médias. Comme je l'ai dit, les radios communautaires étaient déjà utilisées, mais pas autant que ce qu'on avait fait pendant le COVID. Et par rapport à tout cela, il y a un comité, les journalistes sont formés chaque année par rapport aux thématiques de la nutrition. Parfois, ça peut être sur l'allaitement maternel, parfois c'est sur l'alimentation de compléments et surtout par rapport à l'allaitement. Chaque année, durant la semaine de l'allaitement maternel, nous faisons toujours un briefing d'une journée par rapport au thème de l'allaitement pour les journalistes. Peut-être qu'il y a des incompréhensions, mais ils se montrent beaucoup intéressés parce que quand on fait des formations, ils posent beaucoup de questions pour pouvoir comprendre certains aspects. Donc, je pense qu'on n'a pas eu de problème de messages erronés ou bien des messages non adaptés qui ont été diffusés dans les médias. Parce que c'est une collaboration de longue date que nous avons fait avec ces médias-là pour vraiment la promotion de l'allaitement maternel spécifiquement. Merci.
you, Aisha. There was another question related to the implication of influential actors, like, for example, men and grandmother, but I think you have responded by your first answer related to the translation and how you have managed to reach different type or different group of population. So thanks again, Aisha. We've got as well a few questions for
Thank you.
Deborah. So Deborah, someone wanted to know if you have any documented example of spillover when free commercial formula is distributed.
No, I currently don't. I'll just refer that. I was very focused on the avoidance. So no, if we have something, we will send that out again when we send the slides and with the answers to the questions that haven't been answered today. My apologies.
It's okay. Thank you for your answer. But there was as well a request for another example where untargeted breastfeeding donation has been timely reported and addressed.
Is this for me, Brigitte? Yeah, again, I was focused on the poor examples. I will share this to Carleen. Are you able to, off your head, be able to give an example there?
Yes, I can. So there have been quite a few situations over the years where large donations have been reported in the media that they're coming, and where that reporting then has enabled intervention to actually prevent the donations being sent. So this has happened particularly when there are donations that are coming from one government to another government. And you know, if you hear about those donations, sometimes the IFE core group can actually help in preventing those large donations from going ahead. But it's one reason why it's a good idea to keep an eye on what is happening in the media, because sometimes it gives you warning about donations that you're then able to prevent from being delivered.
Thank you all for your question. There is this recurrent question on what to do else in case if breastfeeding is not available or not feasible. So here, during this webinar, we were really trying to see about communication to avoid harmful distribution or harmful intervention toward breastfeeding and infant feeding. We will share with you some link to have more explanation on how and when breast milk donation can happen and when it can, when breast milk substitute can be used. For instance, there was question related to contexts that are really difficult, like for example, right now with the gas war in Gaza. So you have, and again, all this technical documentation will be shared with all of you. Let me check a little bit more in the Q&A, if there was any more. And waiting that, there was an additional question for Aisha. So Aisha, we clearly understood that there was a lot of work to engage with the media and that this has required extensive work. Someone wonder if you feel that it was worth the effort.
Merci beaucoup, Brigitte. Je pense que, comme je l'avais dit, on n'a pas l'impact des messages et des efforts que nous avons faits. Mais je pense qu'il est important dans ces contextes-là de pouvoir continuer les interventions. Nous ne pouvions pas aller sur le terrain. Les différents acteurs communautaires comme les relais, on avait beaucoup de groupes de relais, les grands-mères, ils ne pouvaient pas faire les activités et je pense que c'était une façon aussi de pouvoir continuer à passer les messages. C'est beaucoup d'activités, mais étant donné que c'est des interventions, des activités qui étaient déjà faites à moindre mesure, ça nous a demandé du temps, mais pas beaucoup d'efforts, mais ça nous a permis juste de développer ces aspects-là, comme étant donné que certains aspects ne pouvaient plus continuer. Mais pour moi, c'était important de le faire et on devait continuer, surtout dans ce contexte-là, à pouvoir passer les messages avec toutes les informations qui passaient sur le COVID, avec tout ce que ça entraînait des questions pour les mamans, pour les familles. C'était important qu'on puisse faire, qu'on puisse faire tout ce travail-là. Merci.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for your answer. Deborah, that was one of the last questions we received that is really interesting. It's a nutritionist, and he or she is asking how it can be a fact checker of media information. So meaning what can be the role of field practitioner like nutritionist to check and verify media information?
Yeah, again, this is also where there's strong collaboration with your communications colleagues and your agencies, where they are informed on correct communications for infant and young child feeding in emergency contexts. And some of the examples of what can be done to reach out to colleagues was presented in Carlene's presentation. So, and many organizations, they also have media people who actually do scan the media. For me, when I've worked as a nutritionist in a big organization, I've also gone through some of the pictures and pictures that are presented within the media platform and check that they're conveying the correct case study information, etc. So yes, social media is a challenge because so often it's not moderated, and so we really need, if we're setting up social media, need to ensure that there are moderators available. I hope that answers some of your questions, but yes, it is challenging and it does require time. And also for us as, individuals to all look and when we notice something, to notify the appropriate people. So we need to be proactive and take action to respond. And some of these in emergency can reporting through to the cluster for them to manage some of the communications. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. And related as well to the relation with the media, Carlene, there was this question for you as well on how can we build good relation with media and to ensure, so especially with a journalist.
Yes, there will be something that I have found in my work with journalists is there are some journalists who are very interested in this area, and they're very happy to write articles and to listen to what you have to say, and cultivating those journalists and relationships with those journalists is very important. There are other journalists who will never be interested in this. There will be some journalists who have had their own personal experiences around breastfeeding or not breastfeeding their own baby, which means that they cannot set aside. And so those journalists will sometimes not be helpful at all because they don't want to think about what you're saying to them. So I think it's a case of finding the people who are champions, who will be champions for you. That won't be every journalist, but there will be journalists out there. It's very often journalists who are interested in women's health, and so you can look in your own country, who are the journalists who are writing about women's health, who are the journalists who are interested in women's health issues, who are the journalists who are interested in children, and actually just contacting them and saying, I work in this area, would you like some more information about this particular subject, because we have this problem And we would really like for you to be able to help us when an emergency comes. And you can help us save the lives of children. That work is so important, the work that journalists can do and that media can do. But I would really also urge people to do work with the media and communications people within your own organisation, because very often communications experts move around. They can't know about everything, but this is something that they do need to know about. And so if you can work with them and help them to be confident about this, and fundraising people as well, because sometimes the messages that fundraising people put out aren't very good. If you can bring them on board, then that will also make your job easier.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and all our panelists. I will give the floor to Alex for wrap-up and conclusion.
Yeah, thanks, Brigitte, and thanks, everyone. I just wanted to, maybe there are a few slides I wanted to share with all the participants before the departing words. Next. Yes, next. Yeah, so one thing that I really wanted to emphasize to all the participants, and again, thanks to the Global Nutrition Cluster Technical Alliance for all the support provided, is in case any of your countries, any of the organizations that are connected to this call or other partners that you may have needs any form of nutrition in emergency support, and these are the type of support that you can access, please contact the GNC Nutrition Cluster TA, and you have a link to the website where you can request support. And again, there is several types of support that you can request, and then you can discuss directly with the GNCTA focal persons and and understand if and how you can access that technical assistance. Next. So this is the website, just to give you an idea where you can find request support, and click on that upper button on the right. Next, you have a link in the chat just in case you want to navigate it. And this is the form, a very simple, straightforward form, I hope, that you can just fill, and you will be contacted, as I said, by the focal persons, and they will engage you and understand better on the request you are making and the type of support and the way this can happen. Next. So before I would like to encourage all of you, those that are left, to please do fill out the webinar evaluation. And there is the question that Caroline asked us all actually, all of us, to answer. So please take your time in answering the webinar evaluation. And while I encourage you to do so, and this will be popping up right after you close the webinar, we close the webinar, I wanted to again thank everyone around that supported the design, the actual implementation, the technical assistance that we received from the interpreters, the GNCTA, on behalf of the IFE core group. But in particular, I really want to thank and praise the work of the IFE webinar working group that have done a fantastic job in the past year, if not more, in conceptualizing this activity. Yes, it took almost a year or even more. So many other colleagues have provided support. They may not have been presenting today, but I want you to know that there are so many people that helped put together these activities. So thanks everyone. We are going to launch other webinars, so stay tuned. And these are hopefully webinars that will, again, tackle issues and concerns that you all have. And so we request you to join again and in the conversation. So thanks again, and please do respond to the webinar evaluation. Thank you. Over to you, Sania.
Thank you, everyone. We have come to the end of the webinar. So thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a nice day. Goodbye, everyone.